Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Jim, Tim, this is going to be fun. We're going to have to probably assign numbers here just so we can coordinate this a little bit better. But guys, I wanted to have you on to discuss the HSCA. But briefly, could you guys introduce yourselves? James, if you wanted to start first, and then we'll go into Tim.
Yeah, I was a political scientist at the college level for about 20 plus years, and I've been studying this assassination pretty much since November 22nd, 1963. And I wrote a book on it. He was expendable, national security, political, and bureaucratic cover-ups in the murder of President John F. Kennedy. And I had the opportunity to speak to Bob Blakey on a number of occasions, so I'll be able to bring in a little bit of a viewpoint on that as well.
My name is Tim Smith. I wrote a book on the HSCA and the 52 witnesses that gave public testimony. They obviously interviewed more than 52, but those are the ones that gave public testimony. When I interviewed Bob Blakey in 1998 at his office at Notre Dame, he was teaching law at the time. He told me that day that he chose those 52 as his way to present the HSC evidence to the American public. So that was the impetus of that. And I remember when Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. But unlike James, I did not begin studying then because I was only 7 years old. So I had to wait a little while. The turning point for me was the showing of the Z film in March of 1975, and I've been looking at it fairly seriously ever since.
So the HSCA, since it's going to be the topic of our conversation, I want to ask you guys about the need for a second investigation. How many times do we have something that goes down where there's a need from the public where we need a second investigation? Because obviously the first one wasn't the best sales pitch, I should say. Even though it's lasted like 60 years, it seems like a lot of people have had doubts on it. And it seems like the public perception on it, based on polls, is that a lot of people don't accept the Warren Commission's findings. So the creation of the HSCA, what are your guys' thoughts on the need for a second investigation?
Well, I think if you looked at and I'll just give a quick answer. If you look at the public polling right from day one, the public suspected, large portion of the public suspected that Oswald didn't act alone. And so the conclusions of the Warren Commission didn't go down quite well. And then, very quickly, a number of critics began to introduce areas of doubt in the public's mind. And of course, the big impetus to the second investigation, obviously, was the viewing of the Zapruder film on Goodnight America with Geraldo Rivera. I mean, that just really shocked people to no end when they actually saw this. And just the Z13 sequence, where you see Kennedy's head violently pushed back to the left and to the rear, certainly reinforced in the public's view that shot came from the front, that it could never have come from the rear. And so I think that really put a tremendous impetus to getting a second investigation underway. And I think we can't leave out the Church Committee, which also did work in this area and soundly criticized the FBI and the CIA for failures to investigate conspiracies and failure to follow up on a number of key areas that should have been more closely examined. So I think it was this huge buildup in public distrust that ultimately forced the second investigation, almost as much as you might say Oliver Stone's film, JFK, when he released that information about the documents being locked up until 2026, I think it is, led to the creation of the Assassinations Record Review Board. So I think the public perception here was overriding in getting this second investigation going.
Yeah, I agree with what Jim said. I like his phrase that it was building and building. It wasn't just a one. I don't think there's any question about it that Jim is right, saying that on March 6, 1975, on Geraldo Rivera's Goodnight America, that was obviously a key moment. And when the American public saw Kennedy's head go violently back and to the left at 3:13. They went, wait a minute, we were told he was shot from the rear. That does not look like he was shot from the rear. And that was just kind of like the sine qua non. It was a point of critical mass. And there have been those moments in the Kennedy research community. I think the Geraldo Rivera showing of the Z film, which, by the way, that was not the first time. You could have gone to the National Archives and watched a very bad copy of the Z film and just requested. They put you in a room and you watch it. I'm not sure how many people knew you could do that because you never really heard much about it. And Bob Groden had shown the Z film at Georgetown University even before Geraldo Rivera. But it's obvious. Geraldo Rivera produces an audience that those previous two examples do not have. So Jim's right. It was building and building. All of a sudden, we get the showing of the Z film on national television, and that just was a public outcry, and they had to do something, and they did. And I think initially, and I won't get off on a tangent here, but I think initially it would have gone much better than it did had Richard Sprague been at the helm and not Bob Blakey. And that's not an anti-Bob Blakey remark. It's just I think what we know now is it would have been a much different story. But obviously that's not the point we're dealing with right now. Right now we're dealing with the need for a second one. And there was a need for a second one. I don't think any question about it. There were just too many questions. And I don't think we can minimize the acoustics evidence at this point. Because I know people who were sitting in that meeting with Bob Blakey, and they were critics. And Blakey, I have all the transcripts. Blakey called those people specifically to Washington, D.C., Sylvia Marge, Josiah Thompson, and the like, and said, what questions do you have? What do you think we should be looking into? And then all of a sudden at the end, Mary Farrell brings up, well, there's this acoustics evidence that we think may have recorded the shots. And people who were in that meeting said, Blakey went ashen at that point. It's like, oh my God, now I got to deal with this. What the heck is this all about? And of course, not that the acoustics is not without controversy, to be sure, but it changed everything.
Have we ever had anything before where the public can demand something and actually get it done by the government? I mean, I hate to put it in those terms, but I have to start thinking, is there anybody in a political power where questions were being raised so much where they had to create an investigation? And it gets to the point of a lot of members of the HSCA even talked about not having a real investigation. There hasn't been a real investigation into the assassination of President Kennedy. And that can lead you down a conspiracy road. But the main important thing is they did reveal a lot compared to what the Warren Commission put out there. I think some of their problems were they weren't that much receptive to the general public, more than the Warren Commission they were. But there should have been something open for researchers and other people to really try and funnel in information to be like, hey, there's this you can investigate. They did at a point, but I just don't believe it was as sufficient as I'd like it to be, I guess.
Let me make a real quick point and then turn it over to Jim. There was just so much nonsense in the Warren volumes, especially a lot of stuff at the end of the volume when you get to like 24, 25, 26. But for example, there's like, I don't know, I'm guessing now, but it was several pages of Ruby's polygraph test that they put him on. And you see all the markings, page after page, like 30 some pages. You have no idea what those markings mean, by the way. They never interpret it. They never put a text to the marking. You don't have a clue what that means. So it's just once again, it's cornflakes and a hamburger. You have a lot of volumes there, 26 volumes, over 17,000 pages. But what did they really reveal? And for the most part, either they were guided by people like Spector, how he guided with all these hypotheticals given to the medical evidence, or it was just the Ruby polygraph, which told you absolutely nothing. So people who did take a look at it went, no, wait a minute, something is rotten in Denmark here.
And I think the one thing I would just contribute to this about the Warren Commission is when you go through the 26 volumes, the most interesting thing of all is that every time something begins to lead in the direction of a conspiracy, they cut it off. So as an example, if you say, like if you read the remark of the commission, there is no credible evidence that shots came from any other place in Dealey Plaza other than the Texas School Book Depository. I went back and I put all the shot testimonies together. There were 64 witnesses who said a shot came from the knoll. And 12 of those witnesses said shots came from both places. We're not going to get into a big discussion for the direction of the shots. But the point is, they tried to kill every single instance where you might have a conspiracy. As an example, Just look at the Ruby stalking Oswald on Friday night and Saturday. Cut it off. Everybody was mistaken. All these reporters who said Ruby was there, about 15 to 20 of them, Warren Commission said, oh, they're all mistaken. The only person who was right about what time he showed up at the police station was Jack Ruby. Boy, there's a great witness for you, right? So I agree with that. I mean, it's just, a lot of useless junk in the report itself. And as a matter of fact, if you look at a lot of the stuff that's being released today from the archives, from the records, a lot of that stuff, hundreds of pages of it is just thousands of pages of it is just useless material. You almost feel like you're being set up to invest your time to investigate the assassination, to examine a whole load of junk,
Yeah, that's so true.
Now, was this knowledge to the HSCA during their investigation, or was this primarily coming from just independent researchers and people that decided to read the full volumes of the Warren Commission documents and notice that there's a lot of things that just don't need to be in there that are in there?
Well, certainly that's true. People who did read it came to that conclusion. And I've mentioned this to you before, Robbie, when I was working on my book on the HSCA, going through very carefully what all the 52 witnesses said to their I'm not sure I call it cross-examination, just an examination. It wasn't very long and didn't take much time at all that you could see where this was going. And I mean, it doesn't take Sherlock Holmes to figure out the direction that the interrogators were hoping that this would go. And yet they wanted to say something, and it was their diamond in the rough. The acoustics evidence, in a way, was the diamond in the rough because it allowed the HSCA to say, see, we discovered something they didn't know. What a lot of people don't tell you is there were at least 3 or 4 audio versions of the assassination. There were live radio broadcasts in Daley Plaza that day, not TV, because otherwise we'd have film footage. Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, I was watching that on TV. No, you weren't. There was no film footage, live film footage of the assassination that day in Daley Plaza. There was an audio, and a lot of times that stuff was scrubbed, sometimes by accident, but there were 3 or 4 different audio components to what happened that day in Daley Plaza. Now, the one we have is because of the famous motorcycle, but there were others. And the Warren Commission did look at one of them very briefly and came to the conclusion that it really didn't show anything. Well, we now know that it probably did. But yeah, the HSCA, once you start reading the witnesses, it was kind of disheartening because you knew the fix was in fairly early on, 52 witnesses. I mean, by witness 10, it was obvious to me that they had an agenda. They were not going to say much different. And they really didn't say anything different than the Warren Commission, in the sense that Oswald still did the shooting. They still believe the single bullet theory. Oh, sure, there was a shot from the grassy knoll, but guess what? Missed everything. Really? The easiest shot missed everything. Okay. So in some, I'm not saying the HSA didn't uncover anything. They did. And I think the acoustics may be their badge of honor at the end of the day. But it really has been independent researchers who have either altered that a little bit, whether it's through neutron activation analysis, acoustical analysis, like Don Thomas has done a really good work on. All that stuff is after the HSCA, unfortunately. But, I'm not going to say they didn't do anything, because they did. But most of the things that have been done that we now know have really been done through independent researchers, not government committees.
The one thing I'd like to add to this, and I think Tim brought this up pretty well in his book, Sprague would have been the guy to do this. And I think that was a great shame that he wasn't able to finish the job. Sprague came in here not believing the Warren Commission report, and he made no excuses for that. And one of the things that he wanted to do was to treat this as a murder investigation and bring in as NYPD detectives, as an example, to examine this evidence and go after it. Blakey, on the other hand, he came into this as kind of a neutral party. He really didn't have an opinion either way. But basically what he does is he pretty much sticks to the line laid down by the Warren Commission. And one of the things I think that, says it all was, okay, he went along and he said, yes, there was a fourth shot because he was forced into it because of the acoustic evidence, which I happen to think is the crown jewel of the House Select Committee on Assassinations.
Not the family jewels, the crown jewel.
I'd say it's the crown jewel. It's the best job that was the best piece of scientific evidence that was introduced during the whole hearing.
Absolutely.
And so I think that he's forced into this conclusion, that there was more than one shooter, but that's not something he was headed towards all the way through until the acoustic evidence comes up. And so he's forced to conclude that there's a conspiracy. Now, the one thing that we do have to give them credit for is they did put conspiracy on the record as an official government finding. Okay. That's the only one thing I would say. Let me just take 1 second to throw in a personal experience that I had that fits right in with Tim's thinking here about Blakey pushing the official line. I sent him a copy of my book early on, and I asked him to take a look at the book, and he liked my chapter 1, which was an analysis of the shot coming from the grassy knoll, the evidence for that. But he was really upset by my chapter 5, which is the medical evidence on the assassination. And he was, that chapter really got him very upset because I titled the chapter title is The Medical Evidence, Conflicts, Confusion, and the Negation of Science. I mean, I really attacked the medical evidence in this chapter. I covered the head wound, the back wound, CE 399, the single bullet theory, criticized the autopsy. So he actually strongly suggested to me that if I wanted to get some kind of endorsement for the book, I should rewrite that chapter. Which I didn't. Okay, and it's still in there. And you just have to think of, he was very upset by that, but that's because he was sticking with all of the head wound, right in the back of the head. And then he even argued with me, I looked at the x-rays, I saw the head wounds. Well, that's something we can debate later on, but obviously he wanted to toe the line and stick with the Warren Commission report. And he almost got away with it, but he got caught with the acoustical evidence.
Absolutely. Thomas Canning, who was brought in, he was worked for NASA in the space project, and he was brought in to do bullet trajectory analysis for the HSCA. And he complained, and I published his letter at the end of the chapter on Thomas Canning, where he criticized Blakey because Blakey compartmentalized everything. He would not let the photographic evidence people talk to the medical evidence people. Nobody was allowed to talk to anybody if you weren't on that committee. And I don't know what the punishment would have been. Probably got kicked off, I guess. I don't know. But Canning thought that was a massive, massive mistake. And it was. These people should have been able to talk to anybody they wanted to who were looking into evidence into the murder of John Kennedy, and they were not allowed to. That was a travesty. But that was done on purpose. Because if you allow them to start talking to each other, that could dig up a can of worms that they didn't want to deal with. Then it would have, I'm sure.
And when you talk about Canning, I don't even think they studied whether a shot could have come from the front.
They did not.
Yeah.
They didn't.
The other thing was his inability to talk to the forensic pathologist, as an example, and other doctors at Parkland put him in a position where he was unable to properly locate where the bullet wounds were. And you can't do a trajectory analysis unless you've got the exact wound locations.
Right.
So he was injured by that as well. So I don't know what Blakey's reason for doing that was, but unless just to maintain total control over the investigation.
Before we get into Blakey, I want to ask, a lot of people know the HSCA for concluding conspiracy, but thinking about organized crime being behind it. How much of their actual investigation focused on the medical evidence?
Oh, quite a bit. There's quite a bit. There's quite an amount of time on the medical evidence. And one of the interesting things about it, which is just hysterical if you look at it, when these guys, there was a meeting that was held of the forensic pathology panel that Dr. Wecht was unable to attend. And he complained quite a bit about it, that they knew that he couldn't attend, but they went ahead anyway. And during this meeting, wow, let me just read a portion of some of their remarks. It's very short. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But they had this meeting and they got into a tremendous number of debates. And one of the things that they kept saying when you see Dr. Petty and Angle and Humes talking, they would say, as an example, Angle would say, if that's the right cheek, oh, then it can't be. Has to be more or less. Oh, it's really hard to be sure. They're looking at the photographs and they can't tell what they're looking at. They say, oh, the photographs are blurred. There's no anatomical marks on this portion of the photograph. We can't tell what we're looking at. And then there was a point at which they got into a discussion about the wounds. I'm just going to read you the short amount. There's all sorts of things that can happen, one of the doctors said. The discussion continued about the bullet tunneling through the brain until Dr. Logvam interrupted. I don't think this discussion belongs in the record. At which point Dr. Humes agreed. Well, they continued arguing, and then he says, I don't think this belongs in the damn record. Dr. Humes agreed. Logvan then added, you guys are nuts. You guys are nuts writing this stuff. It doesn't belong in the damn record. Why don't you turn off the tape recorder? Okay. This is the kind of discussion that was going on that we really didn't know about. And they couldn't even agree on what they were looking at. And when you talk about a forensic pathology panel examining the autopsy, you have to keep in mind, they're only looking at pictures.
Absolutely.
The body.
Absolutely.
They didn't see the tissue slides. They didn't see the Harper fragment. They didn't see the president's brain. All of that stuff is missing. So you got a real problem.
I mean, when sometimes when I'm talking about the medical evidence with the HSCA, and I will mention, though this never makes it into the volumes, this comes from talking to Dr. Weck and Dr. Bodden. And one example I'm thinking of, they're at the same conference in DC, and Weck mentions that the pathology panel had come to the conclusion that the back wound was rising at 11 degrees. Then he looks over at Bodden, and Bodden says, yes, that's right. Now, we really need to think about that for a second. If that back wound is rising at 11 degrees, I don't care who you put in that sixth floor window. They didn't shoot from the sixth floor window looking down 60 feet. And when that bullet strikes Kenny in his back, the bullet decides, I think I'll now start rising at 11 degrees. Not going to happen, my friend. So if that wound is, unless you do what Bodden eventually has to, he says, well, Kennedy was bent over. No, he wasn't. He wasn't tying his tennis shoes. He didn't scratching his groin, for goodness sakes. He was sitting in an upright position with his back against the back of the seat. So that's just nonsense, and Bodden has to know that. But they both said, in fact, the entire pathology panel agreed, yes, that wound was rising at 11 degrees. Well, that's true. Game over, my friend. Right now, we can just shut this interview off, because that means I don't care who you put in that sixth floor window, Oswald or Heckle and Jekyll, nobody shot Kennedy in his back from 60 feet in the air looking downward, and that bullet rise at 11 degrees when it strikes him in his back. Not going to happen. So what is that all about? They never explained anything. In fact, they didn't even put it in the volumes. For obvious reasons, they didn't put it in the volumes. So you have that stuff you have to deal with, the stuff that is said by the people after the fact and the stuff that's in the volumes. It doesn't exactly go together a lot of the time. And it's a shame. That stuff needs clarification. Other things need clarification too. The HSCA, I remember reading the volumes early on. I didn't get them right away, but eventually I did. Fairly early on. And I remember reading, they keep talking about frame 327. And I deal with this in my book. 327, 328. And Bodden was going to deal with it. Well, they ran out of time and ran out of money, and Bodden never dealt with it. But they knew there was enough evidence there that there was a possibility that something happened to John Kennedy's cranium at frame 327. And I try to demonstrate this in my book, that his head in 335 looks a heck of a lot different than it does in 327. And that's like 7/10 of a second. That's all. So something obviously happened. My point is not to belabor that now, but there were things like that in the HSCA that you wish when you're reading it, go, okay, keep talking, and then it just shuts down. And we never do get any explanations for that. And I wish we would have, but we don't.
You know, the interesting thing about what you're saying is we couldn't get to these things, and you got to look that there's a little bit of background I think that we need to look at too. Here's Congress sets up this investigation. Now you got a major battle going on in Congress to control who's going to control this committee. And they assign a 2-year period. They want to, limit the amount of funding. They want to limit the personnel. What was Congress's intent? What was the intent of this congressional committee? If they were going to make it, you're going to have an investigation, but you're going to limit this investigation in every way possible.
Well, it's probably one of the reasons Sprague got removed was because he was tossing out numbers that a lot of people weren't too happy with when it came to funding for the HSCA.
Well, you know what? My God, you look at, we're talking peanuts here. What was it? $5 million, $6 million they spent? We're 35 trillion in the hole today.
Half of them have to book an appointment at a 3-star motel with a stripper from one of Jack Ruby's girls that are in the elderly age. So they got to save that money, man. But I do think Sprague would be good. I just think with the HSCA, who really questioned the medical evidence? Why would that be a sacred cow unless you knew that there was something behind it or something didn't add up? And when it comes to the medical evidence, it is a kind of like a house of cards. It can topple a lot of stuff, the single bullet theory. And other things as well too, but it seemed like Wecht was the only one that was open to talk about like trajectories and all this stuff that did not add up, and like where's the brain at?
Well, what's interesting, Robbie, is that Wecht is sandwiched in between Charles Petty on the one side, and I think it was Bodden or someone on the other side. But that shouldn't be surprising because Wecht was the only one that thought there was conspiracy. So obviously he'll be sandwiched no matter what you do. But the difference is, when someone like Larry Sturtevant, who is a ballistics expert, when he starts talking about ballistics, fine. And then he goes off and starts talking about the Z film. Good to go. No one questioned. But when Wecht did that, they would stop and say, Dr. Wecht, are you a photographic expert? Well, no, then just stick to what your expertise is. Nobody else was told that. Only Wecht was shut down when he, ventured outside of his domain at all. Everyone else had carte blanche. You can talk about whatever you want. Talk about the history of comic books. You can talk about whatever you want. No one's going to shut you down. But Wecht was shut down immediately when he started talking about connections between his forensic pathology findings and the Z film. And so something Jim said is true, is that we have to keep in mind, they only looked at pictures or x-rays. They didn't look at the body. Humes looked at the body. So imagine, despite what we may think of Humes, and I think there's all kinds of reasons to be critical of Dr. Humes, but think about how offended he must have been sitting there. He had the body. He was with that body till what, 5, 6, 7 o'clock in the morning? He helped Tom Robinson piece the skull back together to be put in the casket. And then here comes these pathologists who never saw John Kennedy's body. They're only looking at pictures. And looking at pictures, they're saying, well, Dr. Humes, we think you made a mistake by 4 inches. That is huge. If you take the average size of a human skull, that's like saying Humes says, the ball's on the 10-yard line. And then the HSCA comes on and says, no, it's on the other 10-yard line. I stole that, by the way, from Dr. Gary Aguilar, but it's a good analogy. But that's the difference. To be that wrong is almost unheard of in the field. All you got to do is learn how to use a metric ruler, for goodness sakes. And I think James Humes knew how to use a metric ruler, but they said, nope, you got it all wrong. Of course, that led to a whole other can of worms with Ida Docs. You'll get the documents real soon on that, Robbie. You'll be able to read it for yourself, and you're going to be shocked how they try to control that woman and make sure she didn't go off, go rogue and just start talking out of the side of her mouth. They would have lost it, I'm sure. But Jim is right. Keep in mind, even the forensic pathology panel, although they didn't put it in volumes, they have stated to public, and I have it recorded of them saying it, is based on pictures. And when a bullet strikes human flesh, it's hot and it causes the flesh to burn, and then it creates an abrasion column. And a good forensic pathologist, I assume any forensic pathologist, can look at that and determine angle of declination or inclination based on that abrasion column. And so their finding of 11 degrees rising is totally based on looking at the back photograph taken the night of the autopsy, not actually looking at the autopsy itself, because they weren't there. So even though I lean on that heavily in my book, I have to be honest with my audience and say, and I don't think I said this in my book, oh, by the way, this is based looking on pictures. They didn't look at the body.
Let me go back. Tim, you may be able to answer this question if I want to address this to you. Sturdivant was not very helpful to the conspiracy theory.
Not at all.
How come they didn't bring in Dr. What was it? Not Dr. Maybe it was Dr. Dulce, who did wound analysis at the Army installation on wound ballistics and so on.
Yeah.
Why did they bring in Dulce?
Because Dulce said they fired 100 bullets and they didn't look anything like Commission Exhibit 399. In other words, all 100 bullets, Dulce said, were deformed. Whereas, say what you want to about C399, it's not deformed. I'm sorry. There's some crimping at the base, probably caused by the firing pin. But Dr. Weck used to love to say they hung themselves on their own petard. And then he would produce pictures of bullets that did much less damage than the single bullet theory. Bullets that were shot into cotton wadding, or just did through the carcass of a goat, or through the carcass, or not the carcass of a goat. That goat was alive when they shot it, or through the carcass of a human being to simulate the wrist wound in Conley. And yet this bullet, C399, did all of that and came out unscathed. Whereas individual bullets that the Warren Commission produced their own pictures were much more deformed by doing just one of those, as opposed to all that the single bullet theory did. So they hang themselves. Why those pictures are not on the front page of the New York Times, I don't know. Well, yeah, we do know. So yeah, that's why they don't bring in Dulce, because Dulce's not going to parrot the party line, and the other people did. So they stirred him until it's still. He produced a book, and in the book he's still parroting the same nonsense that he did then. He's a company man.
One of the big criticisms of the Warren Commission that I personally make, and others have made it as well, is they stack the deck on the witnesses. You call the people you want. So what I'm getting out of what you're saying and what they did was the HSCA engaged in the same tactic.
Same thing.
Stack the deck.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, out of the 52 that they chose, were any of them actually important to the actual investigation, or we're going to be able to uncover anything? Because you mentioned the fix is in, but it seems like, I don't know if it's because it's a military-run investigation, I guess. It seems like all these guys had excellent military careers, and everybody's looking for their pensions, so don't step on the toes of something that's going to end up costing you your job. I mean, Stokes went into it with Blakey shaking his hand and telling them, keep these people's reputations as if they were alive. You don't say that when you're investigating conspiracy or people's corruption in an investigation in the first place.
Well, one of them slipped in there that didn't help Blakey, and that's Dr. Barber from BB&N on the acoustical evidence. But there's an interesting point that occurs to me. Blakey, as an example, I used to think this was my opinion about it. Blakey said there were 4 shots. Now, if you read Barber's testimony very carefully, Dr. Barber clearly states there were 5 shots.
Absolutely.
And he was not, they stopped the questioning. They didn't, when he put it out there that there was a 5th shot, they didn't pick up and pursue this. I was really surprised by that, but they didn't do it when you read the testimony. And one of the things that I thought was, okay, I'm going to let Blakey off the hook on this to a certain degree by saying what he was doing was making a lawyer's argument. In other words, I only have to prove 4 shots. If I prove 4 shots, I already have approved the conspiracy. Why go further? Why make it more difficult by trying to argue 5 shots? But you know what? That's a real problem. The fact that he stopped at the 4 shots and didn't pursue the 5th shot really has an impact on why the question you just asked a little bit earlier, Robbie, about why they didn't look at this medical evidence more closely. Because if you say 5 shots, you got to ask the question, where did the other shot go? One of the interesting things that the acoustical evidence shows is that between shot 4 and 5 is approximately 1/2 of 1 second, which now fits what we think happened, and that was that Kennedy's hit in the head twice, from the rear and then from the front.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so I think Blakey, I don't know, we can't say what his motive in cutting it off was.
I asked him. I asked him that question.
Oh, okay.
Jim. Yeah. And I said to him, I said, Dr. Blakey, you know that Dr. Barger said there were 5 shots, not 4. He says, I know. And I says, why didn't you pursue that and make mention of that yourself? Because you always hear there was 4, not 5. He goes, that's the easy answer. He said, because I never could have sold it. He said, I could sell 4 shots if one of them missed. But he said, I could never have sold 5 shots. So I didn't even try. He said, had I done that, he thinks it would have totally damaged the acoustics evidence and none of it would have made it through. So he did it, as he said, out of necessity, as he understood it. That's why he didn't do it. Which I thought, oh, okay. I think he may be being honest at that point. I don't know. But he said, I never could have sold that to Stokes and the rest of the committee, let alone the American public, that there were 5 shots. He said, because to do that means we've gone from 3 to 5 very quickly. Which I said, but you did. He says, I know. He said, but you have to put yourself in my position. I was trying to run a committee and I could not have run it well had I said 5 shots. Okay.
What I think he's got a problem here was that the way he was interpreting the evidence, he could never have dealt with 5 shots.
Never. Yeah.
That's really the big problem.
Right.
Now, we mentioned stacking the deck, but if we're talking about a house of cards here, there are certain things that they were able to pull without making the whole thing fall over. Like there's a biggest question for me was why did he put the Jack Ruby's phone records in there? That obviously changes something very big in the whole Warren Commission volumes, was that Jack Ruby was just a low-level mobster. They talk about the connections with Dallas police, but the HSCA, when they put those phone records in there, you see that Jack Ruby's a little bit more connected than we like to think. We end up finding out that he's running guns in certain areas. He owns more than, I think some people still believe he owned 1 club. I was like, well, he owned a couple clubs there. I'm still looking for the Howard Hughes connection because apparently he owned the Silver Slipper, I think it's called. Howard Hughes bought that to turn the sign off because it was too bright when he was trying to sleep. Isn't that weird? But when it came to Burt Griffin putting in the records of Jack Ruby's, and it's showing kind of a bigger mob association. Now, it is headed more towards conspiracy mob focused, but that guy's a lone nut, dude. He thinks that Oswald did it, and he will fight anybody saying that there's no conspiracy in this case. But he put that in there, which does not make sense.
Well, the one thing that they did do in the HSCA, to their credit, was that they extensively investigated Ruby's contacts and the people who he was involved with. And if you go back and you look at the record that they created, they detail all of the convictions of the people that Ruby was dealing with, the kinds of crimes that they were involved with. These were serious criminals. And, like Matthews and a number of other people that he was
Marcello.
very friends with. Yeah. And so that they did a good job on. The one problem I think that Griffin ran into was that him and Hubert went to get additional help to expand Ruby's phone record collection, to examine a much broader portion, but they were refused to help on doing that. And so you had to go back and ask the question why. I mean, when you look at the people that Ruby was calling, it would be like I came on your show today and I said, by the way, last night I was talking to, Tony Soprano at his home in New Jersey. You'd be saying, what? You got Tony Soprano's home phone number? Well, he was calling every one of these people at home. I mean, this guy was well connected. And I think the one thing that we can say, Blakey made a major connection to organized crime, that organized crime may have been behind the hit on President Kennedy. I no longer think that's the case. I think it's probably rogue elements of the CIA. But the proof that organized crime was still involved and probably helped those renegade agents of the CIA is in one word, and that word is Ruby. I mean, this guy was connected, no doubt about it.
I think one thing that stands out to me when I went through the testimony of Louis McWillie, who knew Ruby, yeah, they admit the Ruby stuff. But what McWillie does that caused everybody listening to his testimony who was there that day publicly to just engage in this uproarious laughter was he started talking about Ruby. He goes, yeah, Ruby was there for a couple of days, but like most, I'm no different from most people who knew Ruby. We wouldn't stand him to be around him for more than a couple of days. And of course, everybody laughs because it makes Ruby look like this, childish buffoon. So yeah, they do deal with the Ruby stuff. But no better than David Scheim did in his book. In fact, David Scheim did a much better job, I think, in his book, chronicling all the Ruby phone calls and all that. But when it comes to Ruby, his brother Earl testified for the HSCA, Louis McWillie did, and they both kind of make him look like this buffoonish, out of control. So yeah, the Ruby stuff gets in, but it's always tainted just enough to go, yeah, it's Ruby. We know people like that. Someone will mention someone's name, you're like, oh yeah, so and so, and because you think of them as someone who beats their own chest and they're really less than what they pretend to be. But I agree with Jim. He had all kinds of connections, and whatever the role of the mafia was in this thing, even if it's at a very low level, I still think it is at a level. It's not non-existent at all.
Do you believe that mafia focus was based on the evidence that they were just examining, or do you think it was because that was the only way that they could say conspiracy? Because I feel like the main thing, you might say the acoustic evidence, which we can get into in a little bit, is that one of their main beneficial factors that they had during their investigation. But I would just say leaving the conspiracy door open. That was just enough for a lot of people to start digging into it more, and a lot of people being like, well, a second investigation proved probable conspiracy. Now, it might not be in the area that we'd like it to be when it comes to maybe mob-related activities, but I think that was just because Blakey was focused into organized crime already, and if you have a guy leading the thing, every rock he's going to unturn is going to be more focused towards an organized crime angle, but that also might be the only way that we might have had the conspiracy door open. If you would have blamed the Cubans, would you have had a war like the Cold War everyone talks about?
But even with Blakey, Robbie, he deals with that more in his book than you ever see in the HSCA report. I don't recall anything in the report, unless I'm forgetting something. Oh, sure, they said that Kennedy's assassination was a result of a probable conspiracy. Oh, and by the way, the mob was in on it. I don't recall them saying that. So that's really not something that
they said in the National Archives. It says on that Jimmy Hoffa, Carlos Marcello, Santos Trafficante had the motives and means, and then they gave a brief description. Yeah,
they did say that, but they never really blatantly say that. I recall anyway, the mob did it type of a thing. Blakey certainly argues that more vociferously in his book that he did with I think Billings was his name, as opposed to it making it in the report. But the earmarks are all there. You're right, Robbie. All the fingerprints are there because instead of dealing with some things that they may have or should have dealt with at the HSCA, at the end, it's all mob witnesses. Whether it's Trafficante, Louis McWillie, Ralph Salerno, all these people are always some connection to the mob, whether it's their knowledge of it or actually being involved with it. So yeah, Blakey's going to get it in there, and so yeah, it is there, no question about it. So it's there, but it's not there, type of a thing.
I think one of the reasons that he may have pushed this to a certain degree was because, if you're looking at who would commit this crime, you're asking the questions about means, motive, and opportunity. And one of the things that I think that Blakey pointed out, and it is in the report, about the number of investigations of mafia figures that Attorney General Robert Kennedy was carrying out. As a matter of fact, the day that John Kennedy was killed, I believe Blakey was at Kennedy's house, and they were going to start going over the next list of 800 mafia figures to come under surveillance. And the mob was hurting because of this. And there are a number of recordings that the FBI had of mob individuals making threats against the Kennedys. And of course, we know about Trafficante making a threat, Carlos Marcello making a threat, Hoffa talking about killing Robert Kennedy. So that was in it. So I think that that would have been a natural for him to go down this particular route, to kind of fingerprint the mob. But, one of the things I think that's a real problem, going back, we were talking about the medical evidence before and why we didn't really look at the medical evidence. Malcolm Perry made the statement right after he came out after treating Kennedy in trauma room 1. The wound in the throat was an entrance wound. And the interesting part about this whole thing is how do you look at the testimony of Secret Service agent Landis that he found $3.99 in the back of the car? Have you taken a look at that? Or that really bears on this whole medical evidence and the failure of the House Select Committee on Assassination to really explore the location of the bullet wounds and the fifth shot and all that other stuff. All of this it took years to come out.
Right. I remember always being troubled when John Conley's back wound is described as somewhat oblique and it's not a straight in shot until I read Dr. Shaw's testimony. And I put that in my book. Dr. Shaw talks about, in my attempt to clean up the wound, I also made it look like the shot came into his back tangentially. He says, but it wasn't. It was a straight in shot into his back. But when I cleaned up the wound, it ends up looking like it's something other than what it is. So at the end of the day, it was a straight in shot into Conley's back. It wasn't coming in at an angle at all. But if you don't read Shaw's testimony, you don't know that. For years, I hadn't read it. I didn't know it. And so I was very happy to stumble across that. Although, what is the gal's name? Millicent Craner, who I documented in my book. She's done some wonderful work on the medical evidence. I pretty much got the tip from her on that, but I have to read it. I can't just take her word for it. When I read it, I said, I'll be darned. Shaw did say that. I cleaned up the wound, and I'm the one that made it looks oblong only in this sense because I cleaned up the wound. Otherwise, it wasn't that way before I cleaned it up. So that changes everything because you always hear Posner and everyone else talking about, one of the things that makes the single bullet theory true is because the bullet wound in Conley's back is not a straight in shot. Well, he's wrong. I don't know why he doesn't know about Shaw, but he ignores it or what. I don't know what his reasoning is, but yeah, so there's that.
When it comes to Blakey, we've kind of criticized him a lot here, but do you believe he had his hands tied at a point when it came to obviously the decisions that he had to make? Obviously, personal feelings involved too with the Stoke stuff that I mentioned earlier, but do you believe that he had his hands tied? Obviously, we talk about careers and stuff like that. I mean, I'm not so worried about Blakey losing his career, but it just seemed like nobody was taking the conspiracy angle, which I'm glad they did. They did do the conspiracy angle on some things, but they did not take it seriously. And I'm going to give some examples, and if you guys think of any, you guys can rattle off some too. But we mentioned this with the Umbrella Man. Why are you laughing in court about a guy showing his umbrella and making a joke out of the whole scenario?
Right.
Why does Hess only have I think it's 4 pages and the HSCA about possible deaths linked to the assassination, and what is it? It's a 15-page report. 11 of that is just a magazine of where it got from the Sunday Times and also the promotional movie aspect of executive action. And they're already talking about the statistical probability. We won't even be able to add it all up and do all this. So it's not even a point. And no, I don't think any of it's connected. I'm like, why don't you investigate it seriously? Because people have died in very weird scenarios. Dorothy Kilgallen is the best example. But they treated all the conspiracy aspects, if they did talk about it, as a joke. And that is with the Umbrella Man and then other angles as well, too.
I would just answer it very quickly, and I'll pass over to Tim here. I'm sorry about that. The time factor is a big one. I mean, these guys are operating with only 2 years. In that 2 years, at some point, they have to stop and then write a report. They produce a 12-volume report. So you're dealing with the time factor, the money factor, the personnel factor, and of course, the background in Congress. These competing elements in Congress. Look, one of the interesting things here also is we have to keep in mind whoever was going to be running this, whether it was Sprague or it was Blakey or Mr. X, they were going to be confronted with hostile FBI, CIA, National Security Agency, bureaucratic organizations that were out to protect their power, their prestige. Back in the late 1960s, Richard Helms started a special program to go after Warren Commission critics. And he used friendly sources in newspapers all over the country. So he's got newspaper people going after the HSCA and Blakey in particular. And along, when Sprague was trying to get in there, they definitely targeted him.
I believe eventually they were all wearing T-shirts that said something about the HSCA not having funding, or it was like broke or something like that.
Yeah. Well, at one point, when Blakey got started, he had to fire 4 investigators right off the bat because his funding was cut back. And so, you're just dealing with time, money factors, negative press. You got an army of Warren Commission apologists out there attacking you daily. And so ultimately, you just run out of time. You gotta call a halt to it, compartmentalize, and get the report written. And the good part about it is there is a lot of detail in this HSCA that's useful, very useful to researchers today. Incomplete, a kind of a pseudo Warren Commission report, but at least it's there. So, and I'm sure Tim can add a lot more to it since he's the resident expert on the HSCA.
I think what you just said goes overlooked a lot, and that is there was time constraints, there was money constraints. It's easy to sit back, and I talked to Blake about this. He said, I had to make decisions. Sometimes I didn't have a lot of time to make it. I had to choose wisely who I thought should testify to present our evidence. He goes, and in the process of doing that, he admits I made mistakes. And when he said it, I felt he was being sincere. He was just being honest about the whole thing. You're right about Umbrella Man, Robbie. That turned into an absolute farce. They took the Rickerby photograph, which is a pretty good photograph, probably the best we have of what Umbrella Man looks like. They posted it on the front page of every major newspaper in this country, hunting for this guy. And eventually, we'll give the story of how they found him, but apparently he was working at the Rio Grande Insurance Company, and he just went down there with his umbrella that day, kind of a benign attempt to rattle Kennedy a little bit in the most ridiculous story imaginable, that he's going to say, well, let's see, I'm going to take an umbrella down there and I'll open it up when the motorcade goes beside me, because when Kennedy sees the umbrella, he'll make the connection with Neville Chamberlain, and then that will connect to Kennedy's father that they were soft on Nazism. What are you talking about? I mean, that's just nuts. When you read Louis Stephen Witt's testimony carefully and slowly, he doesn't have a clue about the geography of Dealey Plaza. He's calling curbs pergolas, and it almost makes you wonder, was he ever there? And I don't know the answer to that question. Do I think that Louis Stephen Witt was Umbrella Man? I personally don't. I don't die on the hill over that. But I know people who went to his house to interview him, and what they wanted was exactly what they should have wanted. Give me a picture of what you looked like in 1963 so we can compare it to the Rickerby photograph through some type of photographic analysis. And he pulled a gun on him and told me, get off my property. I'm not talking to you. And so obviously that's short-lived, but he doesn't have a clue. We need to put this in perspective. Louis Stephen Witt was closer than anybody that day in Dealey Plaza, except the people in the limousine when the shots began to ring out. He was right next to the car. And yet in his testimony, he says, you know what? I didn't even know John Kennedy had been shot until he got back to the insurance office that day. What are you talking about? I mean, it's almost like and trust me, their testimony was rehearsed before they ever made an appearance publicly. Every single one of them. In fact, Robbie, I sent you some of the samples of that in the documents I sent you earlier this week. Is that you get so when they were questioned publicly, they knew every question that was coming before it arrived because they had already answered those questions behind closed doors. So none of these questions are going to catch anyone off guard. And Witt wasn't caught off guard like anyone else. But you're right. When Cynthia Cooper opens up the umbrella, of course, it goes, as umbrellas sometimes do, completely the other way. And everyone started laughing. And even before she opened it up, I think Stokes was the one who said, oh, if you're a reporter, better get out of the way of the fire in case there's a flechette dart inside the.
I'm about to say, one guy was in the crowd ducking because he thought a dart was in that thing.
Exactly. So they do the same thing with Witt as they do with Jack Ruby. They turn it into a carnival show. And if you do that, then, oh, yeah, sure, an umbrella, blah, blah, blah. They just reduce it to some type of Saturday Night Live skit, and nobody takes it seriously. And that's exactly what happened with Louis Stephen Witt. But was Blakey serious about the things he said to me and talking to Jim and talking to you? Yeah, I never questioned Bob Blakey's sincerity. I think absolutely he was sincere. When I asked him about the 5 shots, he sincerely answered that. But
it's the same thing with like Secret Service action through inaction. Not acting kind of makes you part of the conspiracy or makes you part of the cover up. With Blakey, he let the CIA just not give him things, and he had a request for certain things, and maybe he felt like he didn't have the clearance or the power to be able to do so. Maybe he didn't, but there's too many memos. And speaking with him, I think he's changed his perspective on the CIA. Obviously agrees that the CIA obviously lied to him about things, but even when he was meeting on a lot of these off the book stuff, like that's a problem when it comes to you're requesting for documentation and they're telling you you can't have this, but you can maybe get a piece of that. So it's like, is this a guy fighting for wherever he can actually get his foot in the door? Or is this someone that goes, oh, I understand, and then just moves on to the next thing?
If you're thinking about one thing, you got to keep this in mind. Blakey didn't get the documents that he wanted from the CIA. But if you take a look at it today, presidents following the HSCA, everybody from Clinton, Trump, even Biden, these guys are still allowing the CIA to keep these documents classified. They can't even get the information. And if you go back and you look at Nixon really wanted to get all kinds of information from the CIA about the Kennedy assassination, and he got nothing. And so in some ways, it doesn't surprise me that Blakey wound up in this situation. But I think the one thing for me that comes out of this investigation entirely is if only we could find out what it was that the CIA was holding and hiding from not only the HSCA, but from the American public to this day. If we could find out, as an example, if we could look at Joe Aniti's, personnel file, what could we learn from all of this? Now, there is one thing that Blakey said to me on a couple of occasions. He said, if you think you're going to find a smoking gun in the records that are still being released, it's not going to happen, because chances are there never was a document like that in there to begin with. And if it was, it's already been destroyed.
I wanted to ask about that, about the destruction of documentation as the HSCA's investigation was going. I just had to relook it up because I made a clip about it, but James Mastrovito was the guy in charge of the Secret Service files. Blakey had gone to some of the members and told them to write on an index card files that you would like to see that they would have. And as he gave them these index cards, the guy, I think it came back in a week or something like that, Blakey did, the guy was destroying documents, and a lot of them were on those index cards. And James Mastrovito also found a vial, and in this vial was what they marked, it was brain tissue, but they called it a specimen something. They sent it to a pathology lab or whatever afterwards. I don't know what happened to it after that. But there was a real issue with destruction of documents and stuff that was important, like having the specimen. Why was that sitting in a filing cabinet with a bunch of other files of stuff. And this guy just bothers. He called it purging the documents, which I was like, what do you mean? There's an ongoing investigation. And then they gave some legal term. It was like, well, technically, these documents are in right to be purged because of some factor of it's been however long. And I was like, well, the investigation, I think, is still technically open. I don't think whoever was part of the Warren Commission closed it, right? He said, let them look through it themselves.
Yeah, one of the things HSCA did at the end was to reach out to the Justice Department and say, okay, these are our findings. Here are the documents, blah, blah, blah. But we think that this should be ongoing, and the Justice Department should look into this and continue the investigation, which, of course, it did absolutely nothing. So here we go again. I said earlier, there are these watershed marks in the Kennedy assassination. Certainly, the showing of the Zapruder film on Geraldo show was one. The HSCA, I think, is one. I think the ARRB gives us even more. Without the ARRB, there's a lot we don't have. And the fact that they put all those medical people on the record, we have their interviews with what's the gentleman who did all the interviews? Can't remember his name. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So yeah, no, it wasn't Doug Horn. It was what was his name? Gracious, I won't think of it.
Gunn, Jeremy Gunn.
Jeremy Gunn. Yeah. And so we have those moments where we do learn a lot, but like Jim said, every president who has sought any files from the CIA, Donald Trump, with all of his posturing, with all of his outrageous behavior, if you think anybody could have done it, he's going to drain the swamp. Guess what? He didn't do it either. None of them ever do, because they don't have the power of the people that they're dealing with. I mean, the CIA. I don't think they think of themselves as someone who answers to the President of the United States.
Did anybody have public doubts, much like Weck did? I mean, I know Weck was probably the most vocal about the HSCA, but when it came to just anybody that served on the HSCA that had public doubts, I mentioned to you guys, I think in separate episodes, about Henry Gonzalez, where he wrote a letter to someone about how his camera was taken out of his car because he was in the motorcade and was able to take some photos. Nothing of importance, but he had his camera taken. He didn't think anything conspiracy. He agreed with the official conclusions, but he also stated that he never believed that there has been a real investigation into the assassination of President Kennedy.
Are you ready for this, Robbie? Henry Gonzalez had John Connolly's assassination suit in his closet for years.
Why?
Yeah. Jackie, with her famous pink suit she was wearing that day, it was in her mom's closet in D.C. for the longest time as well. That's a little less conspiratorial why she did that, as opposed to why Gonzalez had John Connolly's suit. Only God knows the answer to that question, for goodness sakes. There were people that they interviewed, and I would include John and Nellie Connolly. The Warren Commission and the HSCA chose not to believe them. Robert Groden testified. He certainly believes there was a conspiracy. Dr. Weck, he certainly believes there was a conspiracy. Like Jim said, the testimony of Dr. Barger concerning the acoustics. While he may not personally come out and say, I think there was a conspiracy, if he said there was 5 shots, there was a conspiracy. And I would also, who else would I know? Wiseman Ashkenazi, who pretty much rubber stamped the findings of James Barger. So there were witnesses that definitely said there was a conspiracy. They were in the minority, no question about that. And they were overshadowed by the many more who did not. But there were some, no question about that. And, we have files of people who never made the public testimony list, who said things that probably can be advantageous as well. So, yeah, there were definitely people who believed there was a conspiracy on the HSCA. As far as the people who ran the committee, Andy Purdy, not so much. What was the guy's name? Real Answers was the name of his book, and he was
Cornwell.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. Cornwell. I'm not sure that he believed there was a conspiracy, but certainly his book is worth a read, like all of them are, I guess. But yeah.
Cornwell definitely believed in a conspiracy because he was one of the major proponents and supporters of the acoustic evidence.
Yeah, he didn't buy the single bullet theory, but he was the photographic expert or something like that was involved on the HSCA.
Cornwell was a bright guy. He really
he was.
What, Jim?
He definitely was. And he was the one who conducted most of the questioning of BB&N and Dr. Barger. Okay. But going back to your question, keep in mind, LBJ didn't believe this single bullet theory situation. Russell, Cooper, Ford in an interview with the French Prime Minister back, I guess it was in the 70s, told him that we thought there was somebody else involved, but we couldn't find who it was. I mean, that was published I think it was in the 1990s. Okay, RFK, Kennedy never believed it. So you got a huge number of people out here that never supported the conclusions of the Warren Commission or the HSCA.
I want to
us.
Yeah, I want to get to this point because we've mentioned it throughout the episode so far, but the acoustic evidence. What's up with HB McLain? Why does there's like this is it he just doesn't want to be the guy whose motorcycle it was or something like that? It seemed like even the HSCA looked at him much like they look at Stephen Witt with the Umbrella Man situation. Like they interviewed him about it, so that's like if you're going to pick somebody for it, that's your person. But there was never an official like, no, dude, it was 100% your bike. We got you in photographs, but there's never like an official conclusion where all parties agreed that, yeah, this was you, dude.
Yeah. I definitely think it was McLain. I think on your last episode with Don Thomas, his conclusion was absolutely it was H.B. McLain, and to the point that it can't be anyone else. It has to be H.B. McLain. Why H.B. McLain at times waffled back and forth. My feeling about that, he definitely said that his microphone did stick open from time to time. My feeling about that is I don't have much interest in what H.B. McLain says. I have much more of an interest. What does the science tell you? So he can say whatever he wants to, but the science seems to indicate beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was his motorcycle. No question about that. And they did that through all kinds of test shots and, going back to Daley Plaza. It was definitely McLain. But yeah, he's a strange figure. I should send you a copy. I still have it on VHS of him being interviewed by a friend of mine. He flips the guy off at the end of the interview. He's kind of a clownish figure in some ways. But I don't know if H.B. McLain has any idea. You almost get the impression sometimes exactly. You brought up Stephen Witt. Good comparison, because both those men don't seem to really understand the seriousness of their connection with what happened that day. They're just totally oblivious about what went on. And it's kind of disturbing in a way, but they don't. But regardless of what they say, the evidence overwhelms what they say personally. So,
two things on this. Tim makes a very good point. The science says he was there. One of the things that Blakey said that made him convinced that McLain was there was that on the third shot, when they studied the acoustical evidence, they found a diminishment in the signal, the waves, the shock waves from the third shot. And they found out that was due to the motorcycle windshield deflecting part of the shot, because the speaker was on the left-hand side of where McLain on his motorcycle, and the knoll would have been on the right-hand side. So the windshield got in the way, caused a diminishment. But there's one other thing I'd like to add a little bit of maybe historic background to this. You were just mentioning this earlier about all these murders that occurred and violence that occurred to witnesses after the assassination in Dallas. And I think there was a giant feeling of fear inside the city of Dallas. People were scared. And, maybe here's McLain thinking, geez, here I am. I'm the guy whose motorcycle picks up the fact that there's a second shooter. And he's thinking to himself, keep in mind, McLain, there were 50 police officers in the basement protecting Oswald, and Ruby still walked in and killed him. You got to think about, would these people even think that their lives were in danger, particularly in this climate of fear that existed at that particular time? That could be a motive that McLain also had as well. I don't know.
Absolutely.
I would like to hear somebody's conclusion on who the unidentified Asian reporter is that's in the Dallas police basement when Oswald's being transferred. I sent it to you, Tim. I know that, but nobody has a name for that guy. Someone assumed it was this person, but I don't believe it, because that guy specifically was part of Japan, or he was investigating the assassination to cover their ass over the whole situation. But he didn't want to be connected or known to it. So I was like, he wouldn't be a reporter interviewing people. But there's an unidentified Asian reporter. Nobody knows who it is. He's in the Dallas police basement and multiple photographs. And then he's interviewing Henry Wade. Nobody asked his name. Nobody bothered to. Now, you could say that's just because maybe he's a different ethnicity and that's why. Sure. But they didn't question him. And now there's a lot of people going, is this photo faked when I put up the clip for it? And I go, this is why it's very important to be talking about these types of things. Because when you don't address those little anomalies or those little minute details, after enough time, people forget that that even existed. And next thing you know, the record is cut down short even a little bit more. Eventually, we're just going to have the single bullet theory, the acoustic evidence, and then a bunch of other, what we'd call the main building blocks. And then that would be it. There's none of this Dealey Plaza blood spill, or pool of blood, whatever. There's not going to be any of that left. So it's important to keep talking about the case.
I sent those photographs to a friend of mine who is quite the guru when it comes to photographic evidence. And he did not know, he didn't have a name. He just said he was familiar with the guy. He knew he was a Japanese reporter, but that was it.
There was 3 Japanese people in that basement. I didn't realize it. There's a photo of like 3 of them like side by side to it. I was like, did somebody Photoshop this in there? Because I did not see them the first go around.
No, I never saw that. I have to say that.
I'll send you the clip I have up about it. But okay. Yeah, he's in front of the armored truck. He's in the basement and everything like that.
I never noticed that till you sent it to me, Robbie. Never noticed.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah. So one thing about Ruby, though, the Western Union transfer, there's a lot of reporters, because right now where I'm doing clips on is based on all the people that were in the basement at the time Oswald was shot. There's a lot of people for WBAP TV that were stationed across the street, either on Commerce Street, I believe. I might be wrong in saying that. But they said that Ruby was acting kind of suspicious out front of the basement around 10 o'clock. And then around, I think it was 10:30, he approached one of the cars where one of the cameramen were and talked to one of them. And I guess he was asking, do you know when Oswald's going to be transferred? So if we talk about a sporadic moment of, decision to go shoot Oswald after transferring some money, that doesn't seem to be the case based on all these reporters that are spotting Ruby just walking around out front of the Dallas police headquarters. And apparently he strolled right in.
Well, Roy Vaughn swears that no one walked by him down the ramp that day. That's what Roy Vaughn says. Ruby sends the money to a stripper at 11:17. Oswald was shot at 11:21. What a lot of people may not be aware of, and I'm not saying Ruby did this, I'm just saying we have to be at least aware of it, and that is there are tunnels all through the city of Dallas, and you can go from the Western Union to the basement of where Oswald was transferred and never see the light of day. That is at least a possibility. Or some policemen let Ruby in a side door in the basement. That's also a possibility. But the HSCA did come to that conclusion. They said that Sergeant Dean let Ruby in a side door in the basement. The HSC did come to that conclusion. But Roy Vaughn said nobody ever walked by me. Absolutely not. So somebody had to either let Ruby in or he's walking through all these tunnels below the city of Dallas. I don't know. But
the non-conspiratorial answer would be that Ruby did pick up a press badge. And obviously he's showing it. And if you look at that photo with, here's a good one for you, Mr. Kelleher. If you look at the photo with Jack Ruby where he's got his notepad and he's wearing the glasses, look all the way to his right. There's the Asian reporter that's unidentified. He's in that photo. We don't know who he is. That's fucking nuts to me. I'm sorry. I had to express that. But when it comes to Ruby being involved in the basement, I mean, if he's wearing press credentials, I've looked through all these testimonies of these reporters. Either there was no check of their identification, because they were carrying camera equipment with their stuff labeled on the side. Nobody bothered to stop them. He's like, oh, he's associated with the press. That could be a way he got in, but I think based on all the testimonies we have from officers, Detective Cody, who was ice skating with Jack Ruby, there was a known association with Jack Ruby. He was all in those headquarters all weekend. It just makes it very strange that he waited for the transfer for the shooting, even though he was carrying a gun on him all weekend and everyone knew he carried a gun, and he could have shot him at any moment when he was in front of all these reporters.
It's kind of funny that in his car, he had thousands of dollars in his car that day.
And his dog, Sheba.
And his dog was there, too. Of course, the IRS seized that money almost immediately. Because he was behind on his taxes. But yeah.
If PETA existed, they would have seized the dog. So
absolutely.
On Saturday, by the way, there was a detective, I think his name was Brown, who late on Saturday afternoon saw Ruby trying to get into the basement, trying to find a way into the basement. He saw him late Saturday afternoon. By the way, Roy Vaughn passed the lie detector test as well. And 3 Dallas police officers drove out in a car just at the time that Oswald was being led into the basement. Pierce, Lieutenant Pierce, Maxey, and one other one, I forget his name now. They said nobody went down that driveway. And I remember when I went to Dallas, I had a Buick Park Avenue, and I drove it right onto that driveway. You couldn't open the doors on the car. It would hit the concrete wall on both sides. So if a car came out there, there was no way somebody was going to be able to walk down, and those 3 guys coming out would definitely have been able to see them. And there was a bunch of witnesses across the street, a Sergeant Don Flukes, who said he knew Ruby. He was parked out there. He was watching the transfer. He said nobody ever went down that driveway. So
there's a lot about the basement that I'm starting to learn about. Like, even, did you know there was somebody apparently arrested there before the shooting of Oswald, a Negro? I'm not, that's their language, not mine. I don't use that, but I'm just saying they used a different word. But it was a reporter in his testimony. He talked about he heard a gunshot, and then this guy screamed that we got this guy. And then a little bit later, there was the shooting of Oswald. I don't know about that. I don't know what he heard. Maybe he heard a car backfire, and then but apparently there was this guy jumping in and climbing on top of cars in the basement. So I don't know if he was trying to get a view. I could send you the clips I have up about it, but it's either William Rayleigh or it's Oliver Oakes or Jet Jameson. One of those 3 in their testimony talked about that. So like I said, the little minute details that we end up missing. Is there anything that you guys uncovered about the HSCA that is not public knowledge? At least it's not something that a lot of people know too much about, even if it's something weird or it's just something as an aside. I'm just interested if there's other areas that I'm going to end up either coming across, or if there's something in a testimony that you guys came across about with the HSCA, or just something you found either maybe suspicious and it might need more research.
Go ahead, Jim. Go ahead.
All right. I have to say, the only thing I would like to see them follow up on is what did they not get from the CIA, and what does this background on Joanides look like? That's the only thing I would say would really help us tremendously.
Yeah. I think, Robbie, you know about my Ida Doc story, so I won't belabor that. But that was a very odd discovery, one that I completely stumbled upon by accident, because I saw this picture of the brain, and she hadn't signed it. She signed everything. And so I began to inquire about that. As you know, Robbie, I was rebuffed by other assassination researchers. Oh, you're just being too hard. She's just a lady that just forgot. And I said, you may be right. I'm just trying to follow up, trying to figure things out here. What that uncovered, and you'll see, Robbie, when you get the documents in the mail, you are not going to believe what you're about to read. I'm not kidding. Because what they ended up doing, they ended up giving Ida Docs pictures of gunshot wounds that were not gunshot wounds on John Kennedy's body. They gave her pictures of gunshot wounds from a pathology book that Bodden helped author later on after he was on the Clark panel. And she took those pictures of those gunshot wounds and superimposed it in the cowlick area on the back of John Kennedy's head in one of the autopsy photographs. And I asked, and this isn't just me kind of guessing, I asked Bodden at WEC 2003. And I said, Dr. Bodden, did you give pictures of gunshot wounds to Ida Docs? He goes, absolutely we did. I said, why would you do that? He says, because we wanted people not to forget or not to mistake exactly where the wound was. To which I said, well, if there was a wound there, they shouldn't mistake it. If it's an actual bullet wound, he says, well, we wanted to make sure that they didn't. So he was up front. He said, absolutely we did. But that's just nonsense at the end of the day. Because you look at that photograph that she sketched and drew, and that wound does not look like what you see on the original autopsy photograph. What you see on the original autopsy photograph looks like a little blood droplet. this definitely looks like an entrance bullet wound in the back of John Kennedy's head. And to do that, they moved the wound 4 inches from where Hume said it was to where they say it was, simply by looking at photographs, not looking at the body. And I think the reason they did it is because there was this massive wound on the right side of John Kennedy's head. If you put the bullet wound here in the colic area, it's a perfect in-shoot, out-shoot. You put the bullet wound 4 inches lower, now you have to explain how that bullet going down is going to then go up outside the right side of John Kennedy's temporal part of the skull. I think that's probably why they did it. But Ida Dox, I'm sure, was told to do it. In fact, you'll see the documents, Robbie, when you get them. She has sent memos. Ida, you can do better. We need to get pictures of bullet wounds and send them to Ida. They're not trying to hide anything. And now we have a conspiracy to kill Kennedy. Now there seems to be somewhat of a conspiracy to cover it up. Because by doing that to the evidence, you're playing hard and fast with the evidence that you really have no right to do. And so that was I don't think it was a great discovery. I didn't discover a continent, for goodness sakes. But I did stumble upon that, and it spoke volumes the more I looked into it.
Not to leave out Ford moving the bullet wound to the base of the neck.
Yeah.
I guess when it comes to the HSCA, I want to ask, why do you think that researchers tend to be kind of polarized to the HSCA's findings, even if the fix is in? I mean, that's a good answer for it, but there's a lot of things where I'm like, even just opening up the door for conspiracy. It seems like a lot of researchers, when it comes to the acoustics, and then when it comes to just the whole discussion of the HSCA is not heavily investigated by a lot of researchers. Tim, you're one of a few that I've seen actually talk about it.
Yeah, and the only reason that I even did it, Robbie, is because that was my conclusion. Not because I thought I was going to be a great light bearer as much as nobody's writing about this. I thought, well, I just want to create a guide. And I used the 52 witnesses that appear publicly as a platform to present the evidence of what they found, which is exactly what Blakey told me. I tried to update it as best I can through the year 2022. And then, so I'm just trying to create a guide is all that I was trying to do. But I think something that Jim said earlier is kind of, if it's an answer to your question, Robbie, and that is, I am willing, this is going to sound like a strange thing to say, and I've never said it before until right now, but I'm willing to put up with some of the nonsense of the HSCA for the sake of the acoustics, because the acoustics to me changes everything in this. To me, it's not debatable. It's just a fait accompli. And if that's the only thing that the HSCA did, and they did other things too, I'm okay with that. I'm willing to suffer the arrows of discontent with the other stuff, because the acoustics to me is so important and so huge that I'm willing to tolerate the other nonsense. Strange answer, I know, and I'm not sure how comfortable I am even with what I just said. But to me, the acoustics is that important.
Yeah, well, I think the only thing that obscured this whole thing, if you want, I think Tim's absolutely correct here. The only thing that obscures takes the emphasis off what they did was, Blakey's a controversial guy. The way he conducted this was pretty controversial. There are failures here. I mean, when you look at neutron activation analysis, which we didn't have a chance to talk about today. But here's this magical, so to speak, theoretical construct that says we can tell you where every particle of every bullet that's in that car came from, and they all came from the bullets fired in Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle. Okay? Well, it turns out this is one of the most bogus theories, scientific theories you can think of. By the early 2000s, the FBI had totally discarded using neutron activation analysis. It was just a failed theory. So that basically, what we know today is that those fragments of the bullets that were in the car could have come from any number of bullets. You can't simply say it came from the 3 bullets used by Oswald, which is what Gwynn tried to argue. Okay. And, the HSCA said, oh, we've got this evidence and we can show that it, and this fits in with the whole thing of Blakey following the Warren Commission. The 3 shots all of the bullet fragments came from the bullets fired by Oswald. Well, that turns out to be complete nonsense. But, all that controversy around it, obscures the workings of the committee as a whole. So that's why I think Tim's book is so good, because it focuses on the whole process itself and, where its failings were. So, and of course, the very fact that it produces this conspiracy result is what everybody hones in on, not what a bad job they did in a number of areas. And that's great about what Tim is exposing here. But I do agree that acoustical evidence, that stuff is solid.
I would say this, Robbie. One of the reasons I wanted to update the evidence to the year 2022 is if I leave Vincent Gwynn's chapter alone and don't update it through the information that Jim just gave us, it's archaic prehistoric evidence, because with the updated evidence by people, by the way, who had no interest at all in the Kennedy assassination, whether it's Spiegelman, Tobin, Grant, any of these people, they had no interest in the Kennedy assassination. They're just metallurgists, which, by the way, Vincent Gwynn was not a metallurgist. He was a scientist, but these guys has PhDs in metallurgy. And at the end of the day, they say this is just junk science. And as Jim said, the FBI closed the only place they were doing this type of analysis because they said this is junk science. We're going to get overturned every time if we keep using this. And Blakey used to always say, and I never knew how to answer the question. He would say, well, this is the linchpin. This connects Oswald's rifle to the bullets. There's no way around it. And I used to say, gosh, I don't have an answer for that. Well, we do now. And that's why the update was absolutely necessary for the neutron activation analysis evidence.
So I was going to ask you guys the significance of the HSCA, whether it's like the Zapruder film where it's like, hey, it's an interesting watch. Please watch it if you do. But there's just not really anything you can really do with it besides it being an interesting film, at least in my opinion. I mean, you could sit there and try and figure out what frames and what all this he got shot at and all that, but it's just an interesting thing. I think everyone should watch the Zapruder film. But with the HSCA, their documentation is a lot harder to read for me than it is for the Warren Commission. I like the Warren Commission stuff because it's pretty simple, just taking testimony from like a random person who sees a 6'7" blonde guy with a rifle and a bag walking through Dealey Plaza. I'm like, I don't know what that means, but it ain't nothing like Oswald being up in the 6th floor. But when it comes to the importance of, like, obviously the conspiracy aspect, but in your mind, when it comes to just looking at the HSCA as an investigation, and to anyone that would be a new researcher or anyone interested into the case, how would you give like a brief little, like, yeah, you can look into the HSCA, but they're same thing as the Warren Commission. They had a set thing. Seems like the Warren Commission obviously was set with Oswald did it, and the HSCA was like, hey, don't mess up the Warren Commission findings too much. You can shake it, but don't tear the house down.
Well, what I would say to you is this. The only thing that the HSCA actually did was to keep the debate going. Did Oswald act alone, or was he part of a conspiracy? They kept that debate going. Now, you'd have to say to yourself this. If it wasn't for the acoustical evidence, that didn't show up. Blakey would have simply said, the Warren Commission got it right. And it would have been over. I mean, at that point in time, you would have had 2 federal investigations that said, nobody was involved. It was Oswald acting alone. But the very fact that a second official body of the United States government comes to the conclusion, there was a conspiracy, there was more than one shooter, that kept it going. And then it opened the way to ultimately, the receptivity that a film like JFK got, which also leads to the Assassinations Record Review Board, and then kind of brings us to the state where we're in today, where we do know a hell of a lot more about what happened. I think now we really do know the shot order in Dealey Plaza. We know the double headshot, the back wound, the one shot miss, one shot hit Connolly. We now know what happened. The only thing we don't know is the who. That we're still working on. That's the one we'll probably never find out. But at least it kept the debate going. That's the way I see it.
In that sense, Robbie, I think what Vincent Salandria said was true back in the 60s, that this really, especially today, it's a false mystery. There's no mystery anymore. We know there was a conspiracy. The evidence, I think, is overwhelming. I would say to someone, if you're going to pick up the HSCA volumes, it probably would be good to know something about the Warren Commission as well. But to me, when you're reading any type of a document, you've just got to ask certain questions. We can't just believe everything we read. We challenge everything we read. Where's the evidence? Is the evidence really there? What are they not saying? And the problem is it takes a long, long time to work through all this stuff. I can honestly say that in the year 2024, it's only been the last couple of years. And I've been seriously looking at this since 1975. I'm kind of comfortable with how I talk about it in the last couple of years because so many questions have been answered that we did not have answers to. We now have questions. We now have, I think, solid answers to the acoustics, to the neutron activation analysis dilemma, to the shot sequence, all kinds of things. Oswald at times is still kind of a mystery, to be sure, but we know a heck of a lot more than we used to. The one thing I did not put in my book because it would have been forced, Robbie, was a character by the name, and he does appear in the Warren volumes. Michael Payne brings him up, a guy by the name of J.D. Wilmoth. What an interesting character. He appears at the home of Ruth Paine on Tuesday before the Friday of the assassination. He had called there to get permission to come to talk to Marina because he said, I want to talk to someone who was from the area of, as they would say in Russia, Archangel, from that province. I want to see what someone's accent sounds like from that area, which is where Marina was from. The problem is, the more you find out about J.D. Wilmoth, it's just nonsense. J.D. Wilmoth had a doctorate in Russian. He taught Russian. He lived in Russia for like 20 or 30 years, as far as kind of like, I guess, an ambassador for the United States. This guy needed to listen to Marina, like nobody. The whole thing is ridiculous. So the question is, what the heck is he doing? What is he doing there? What is he calling them for? I mean, he's obviously military intelligence. We know that because he was military intelligence. He was in the army. So he's kind of an unknown figure in this whole thing. And the HSCA, I looked and looked and looked. They never dealt with him at all. So it's not an HSCA problem, but is certainly an interesting little dilemma with Mr. J.D. Wilmoth because he does come up on the record. And he does go out and he visits Marina and Ruth Paine on Tuesday before the assassination. The only question is why? He's military intelligence, fluent in Russian, does not need to talk to Marina, and there he is. So I don't know. There's all kinds of little, Jim and yourself, Robbie, come up with all these little dilemmas. You go, what the heck is that about? Most of the time you go, I don't know. I don't know what that's all about. It's interesting, though.
Does the HSCA's interview of Marina change any of your opinions on Marina's testimony? A lot of people consider her an unreliable witness, mostly because she said one thing to the Warren Commission or was forced to say something, and then HSCA, she says something completely different. You could say that's after years of coming across researchers and being contacted by people, but I used her as a reference point when I spoke to Posner because she couldn't identify the difference between a rifle and a shotgun. The Warren Commission said that she stated that that was Lee's rifle.
Well, she doesn't become a U.S. citizen until after the Warren Commission and after the HSCA, so maybe she was feeling still a little uncomfortable. I don't know. But I know when reading her testimony for my book, her most repeated claim is, I don't know or I forgot. And, maybe she forgot. Maybe she doesn't know. I don't know. I can't read her mind. But she became very frustrated to the point that the HSCA, near the end of her testimony, says, look, we have a list of contradictions that we have of you saying this, and then later on you say this. So they were very frustrated with her, but did nothing about it. I'm not sure what they could have done, but you can tell they're very frustrated with Marina. So I don't know what the deal is with that.
I wouldn't put a lot of reliance on anything she had to say. I don't think you would want to use her to make any part of your case in arguing about the assassination.
I agree.
Yeah.
Is she a strong enough witness like Jack White?
Is she a strong witness?
Yeah, like Jack White.
No, I don't think so.
Tim? No.
I would say Jack White wasn't a strong witness, and neither was Marina.
There you go.
Yeah, as you know, Robbie, Blakey really regretted Jack White you put on there. So yeah.
Well, I appreciate the time you guys gave me to talk about the HSCA. Like I said, I'm trying to focus in some episodes on some specific areas, and just getting everyone's perspective on it because I believe that there's going to be at least keep a record out there for anybody that's new looking into. There's obviously a lot of areas. I'm going to have to put the Assassination Records Review Board up on there. I've interviewed a couple of the guys, John Thunheim and David. Was David Montague part of the HSCA or was he part of the Assassination Records Review Board? David, never mind. That's maybe a question we'll do off air. He was a part of one of those committees. I think it might have been the HSCA. He might have been the youngest member. I don't know if you know Tim.
Who's the one guy you interviewed, Robbie? Samulak is his name or something like
Tom
that?
Samuluk is a
Yes.
ARRB guy.
Right, yeah.
But then there's David Montague, and I don't know if he was a part of the Assassination Records Review Board, maybe, or
he was ARRB. I think he was
Okay.
ARRB.
Because he looked at all the material that is we haven't seen yet, and he said he left there at the National Archives. He left there knowing full damn well that Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't the lone assassin. So
Was there some questions he would not answer that you asked him because he just couldn't?
yeah, the Clinton incident with Oswald. You can go on Mary Farrell's site. There's no files there, and that's a lot with like the HSCA stuff. I would click a key person that they would have, and there's like nothing. And I'm like, well,
Right.
where the hell that document or whatever interview or something I can be able to see?
Yeah. Well,
But is there a place where people can find your links, Mr. Kelleher? If you'd like to go first, and then Tim will end with you.
Sure. You know, my link is John F. Kennedy Political Science Assassination Study.com. I'll say it again. John F. Kennedy Political Science Assassination Study.com.
And you can get He Was Expendable at Amazon, Walmart. And
Yeah,
all
he
the
was
available.
expendable at Amazon.
yeah.
That'll cover it.
Robbie, I'm off the grid, as you know. I have no links whatsoever except my book on Amazon.
Well, I will put those links in the description for people to be able to click. I appreciate the time again, guys. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.